Welcome again, our Empowering the Teachers Fellows from Nigeria. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Yes, so good to see you. And Professor Strzepek from Wellesley. He just left. Okay. And all of you who are students and others, welcome. It's great to have you here tonight. One of the things that the MIT Africa initiative really promulgates are internships. And so if you happen to be interested in an internship, I know if you're a graduate student, that's less likely than if you're an undergraduate. But if you happen to be interested in an internship, there are some really awesome opportunities available. There are year-long opportunities, there are month-long opportunities, and they're in various different kinds of fields. So if you do have some time, please contact Mary Pine, our interim program manager, and she'd be very happy to speak with you about these opportunities. Okay. Let us move then to our program, and the way we're going to do this is have our 3 speakers in a row with no questions, and then we'll have them all up at the end for a kind of a panel forum discussion that will make it a much, I think, richer and more interesting discussion. So our first speaker is Rob Stoner, and I have a blurb about you, so I'm going to do it before you start, okay? Rob is MIT's Deputy Director for Science and Technology. He also directs the Tata Center for Technology and Design. Rob Stoner served as a study group member in the recently announced MIT Future of Solar Energy study. He's the inventor of numerous optical and electronic devices. Yeah? That's very interesting.
My mother wrote this book.
It's great. It's really good to have her report. It has an extensive international business background, having held senior positions at Intel and Zygo corporations, and founded technology companies in the United States and Europe. He was also an adjunct professor of engineering at Brown, and immediately prior to joining MIT, he served in senior roles at the Clinton Foundation in Africa and India. No. Yes, this is really interesting. I didn't know this. So if you want to add anything, please, Rob.
Thank you. That's what happens when you let your mother write your words. So we don't have a remote here, right? So going back. What's happening?
Which one are you going to hang up? That's it.
Oh, wrong computer.
Just need to read the second half of his bio now.
Well, thank you for that kind and lengthy introduction. It's really extraordinary to be here to see so many people interested in Africa, and not all of them Africans by any stretch. So I hope we can do this again. It's not on. Can you hear me without it? Am I audible, everyone, without this? May I not use it? If you can't hear me,
I think it's actually on.
I couldn't really hear it.
Because when you hold it close to
all right, so I'm going to start. There's a real problem, so this is a huge topic, and these are not the references. I don't expect to record them, but the IEA has done a lot about this. That's the International Energy Agency based in Paris, which is under the OECD. And there are a number of excellent publications that I'll refer to, that you can refer to too, and one of them is this free one entitled Africa Energy Outlook. It's produced every year now, although only recently. So I'll be referring to this stuff. I'll also be referring to a number of projects and slides taken from them by the one and only Amy Rose, for example, and Vivian Lee, she's sitting there relating to microgrids and complicated power flows. What I'd like to really get across to you in setting up Amy and Ken is scale. Africa is a very big place, energy is a very big topic, and I think understanding how energy is playing out at different scales is an important aspect. So here we have a map of the world produced by the IEA, and what it shows is that in most parts of the world, energy or electricity access, and I'm going to make the sin of equating energy with electricity. And I realize that there are other issues connected with energy besides electricity, but since electricity is mostly what I work on, that's what my slides contain. However, we have done some interesting stuff on energy for cooking, and that's something that we can talk. So this is all about electricity. So this map shows electricity access in different parts of the developing world: South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and South Asia. And in each, it shows the current situation in these darker colored graphs. The current situation in this case is 2009, and the situation is forecast by the IEA in 2030. And what they're showing is, by the size of the pie, the number of people who are not electrified at each of these times. And you can see that only in the case of Africa does the number increase from 2009 to 2030. So that's a very important fact. And that is not because the infrastructure is going away, it's because the projected rate of expansion of the electricity systems in Africa is projected to be slower than the rate of population growth. So you end up with a smaller proportion, but a larger number of people not electrified. Significantly, as is reflected by this big purple part of the pie, most of those people are rural. So this is a rural problem, and it's particularly substantial in Africa. So what the IEA tried to do was calculate, using a very sophisticated economic model called the World Economic Model, what it would cost to electrify all of these people. And by electrify, they didn't mean electrify them the way we're electrified here, where we've got sort of unlimited electricity. We don't really think about it being limited. But in their calculations, they included only a minimal level of electrification and allowed it to expand over time as demand is projected to grow at the individual level. So they calculated it, and what they came up with is a total number for that entire map of about $698 billion, above the normal economic rate of infrastructure growth. In other words, the infrastructure is going to keep growing along with the economy. That's all fine. This is another $700 billion that would have to come from somewhere in order to make that happen. So that's the scale of the investment problem. And in the Sub-Saharan African case, almost half of the problem, about $350 billion in addition to the normal economic amount we have found. There are a lot of reasons why people don't invest in energy, in electricity infrastructure, okay? And they're important, and this in part is set up for Ken and Amy. First is a problem that we have everywhere: political, sovereign, and increasingly terrorist risk. We do have them everywhere, but the problem in Africa is we don't have electrification, and so these things are actually barriers to investment. Second, we have very small consumption per meter. That is to say, people don't use very much electricity, and therefore it's very hard for the electrical system investor to recover his investment from normally affordable electricity rates. Here, the recovery period is typically on the order of 20 years. At the rate at which a typical African uses electricity, which is about 1/40th of what our consumption rate is, that's more like 800 years. It's not a very attractive investment. The infrastructure will collapse and melt into the ground by the time it's paid off. So that's a barrier, and it points us in a number of technical directions. Second, there's this very large rural population, and that exacerbates this cost problem, because it costs more to extend long electricity lines into rural areas and to collect from people at the other end of the wire. Second, or rather fourth, there's very low economic value in small amounts of electricity. At least economic value that can be realized in the short term. We think of providing light, enabling people to study at night, and that's true, but you don't see an economic impact from that for many years. And so providing someone with electricity doesn't instantly increase his ability to pay back, which is another problem for investors. Fifth, there's weak institutional capacity in many African countries as their experience grows with these large infrastructure systems, and it's just a challenge to keep up with very aggressive plans. The penultimate point is that there's also political interference, as there is everywhere in the world, but more so in developing countries than in developed countries, in setting tariffs. Electricity is considered to be important to political constituents, and it is, and they want it. And you can make yourself very popular as a politician by requiring the electrical company to lower its rates below the level at which they can recover the cost of operating the electrical system. And we find that in many countries, power companies are operating in red as a result of this. And an insolvent power company is not one that readily borrows money and builds further infrastructure, so another impediment to further investment. Finally, these are very small regional markets. Africa is a very large continent. The population in any country isn't that large. Pretty large in Nigeria, but for the most part, not large, and it's spread over a large area. That means that if power companies are restricted to national borders, they're serving relatively small populations. And as I said, the consumption per member of that population is small. That means that to build large power plants, which are the kinds of power plants that are the least expensive from the point of view of kilowatt hour delivered, you have to somehow find more customers. And find more customers means you have to find customers in other countries. Amy's going to talk about how that problem can be approached by pooling power networks and harmonizing the regulatory practices between countries. So don't be discouraged by that. It just says that we got to do some stuff differently. And we have an opportunity to do that because we're operating in a very green field in most countries. Most of these countries in Sub-Saharan Africa have only 20% or as much as 40% of the population's electrified. So in rural areas where it's very expensive to bring electricity, new solutions have begun to pop up, and these take advantage of recent advances in photovoltaics, which have mostly been in manufacturing, that have led to dramatic drops in the price of photovoltaics around the world, including for very small photovoltaics. And that means you can use them to power very small appliances, very simple appliances, like these solar lanterns here, that also have LED light bulbs and usually lithium-ion or some variant of lithium-ion batteries. These things can be bought for about $10, but they can get fancier. And over the last several years, they have become increasingly fancy with the addition of phone chargers, radios, in some cases even built-in Wi-Fi, and sort of transformed into something more than lanterns. They're called kits. And then finally, you can get all the way to home-scale systems. Home-scale systems are expensive. They used to be a few $1,000s. Now they're still kind of on the order of between $500 and $1,000. So really not accessible to most people. But these less expensive things are very accessible. And furthermore, they compete very favorably with existing lighting solutions. And this chart, which I won't bother to go through because I'm really already running out of time, shows how the cost of a typical solar lantern compares with the cost of buying a hurricane lantern, a kerosene burning lantern, and providing fuel for it. So you get a total cost of lighting of around $63, whereas the cost of a solar appliance or a solar lantern at $20 has no fuel associated with it, with a very large difference in total operating costs. So it's attractive to people, and the result has been a very large rate of growth in the use of these sorts of systems. And here you can see this compounded annual rate of return of 9%. So that's pretty spectacular. But it only goes up to about 3 million sold as of 2012 when this chart was made. The available market is about 112 million households in Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's just the very beginning of what I think is a trend. Moreover, there's a market for a similarly large number of households for these solar kits, the more complex solar appliances that are manufactured in factories, carefully designed, optimized in some sense, and purchased in bulk. So you get a lot for your buck in those cases. So there's an awful lot of blue space here available to these innovative new products and opportunities for young engineers to develop new products. Certainly. You can start to go up the ladder from there. And there's this possibility of having overall electrical systems or electrical power systems that are comprised, unlike ours, which is monolithic, of many different modes. So you can have mixed mode energy systems. And this is what most of the people at that table over there work at, with me and Ignacio every night. At the very bottom end, you can have lanterns and SPLs. But as you work up the ladder through solar home systems and begin to think about the grid, you can have isolated grids. And we call those microgrids or mini grids. Those terms are used interchangeably and are defined in hundreds of different ways. And I won't attempt to distinguish between them because I don't know. And this shows how those multi-modes might be arranged optimally in a couple of countries. On the top is Nigeria, on the bottom is Ethiopia. These are being our IEA calculations. And what they indicate, we can go into details, is that in areas where there's existing power infrastructure, high voltage and medium voltage power lines, that's what these blue things are, the optimal plan calls for electrifying houses and buildings next to those lines first. But as you get farther and farther away from the blue lines, you begin to get into areas where other solutions make more sense. So in the green areas in Nigeria, you've got microgrids and mini grids. In the purple areas where you're just too far out and people are being too far apart, you have individual systems like lanterns and solar home systems. And so that gives you a lowest cost way of meeting the IEA's objective of providing everyone with some level of electrification, not the same level we have. And that's the same sort of picture for the much less densely populated Ethiopia. So what do these microgrids and mini-grids look like? We're trying to find that out, and Yadeli on our left is designing a microgrid as part of her project with the Tata Center for a small village in Rwanda. So this is Rwanda, and the village is called Mutete, and you can see here is Mutete, Karambi, which is in Mutete, which sits at the top of a hill. Rwanda is a very hilly place, and that makes electrification even more expensive. Now you've got to run lines not long distances out to rural areas, but into ravines and up cliffs to be able to reach these communities. So it's advantageous to create purely local infrastructure. And the challenge is to try to recapture some of the economies of scale that are afforded by the large area grid that units have. And you can't recover them all. Rural electrification costs more than urban electrification. There's a lot more wiring, a lot more losses. And so we never get all the way there. We get partway there. And one of our projects is trying to determine how you can trade off reliability or availability and the level of service that you provide, how many kilowatt hours per day or per month, for example, in order with cost, in order to provide the best possible service at an affordable amount of money. When you can do that, of course, private money is much more willing than it would otherwise be to move in. There are a lot of customers to serve. They're able to pay their bill. And the observation is that when you meet those conditions, demand eventually begins to grow over time. Our expectation is that demand in a community like Karabi will ultimately grow to a point where individual consumption is high enough to make it an attractive place into which to extend the grid. Because finally there'll be enough consumption to be able to pay off those wires that I talked about initially. So you can see this is an interesting case video. I won't describe it much because I'm running out of time. And this shows how Kenneth has calculated these photographs that indicate how this trade-off is going. So we're learning about that through simulation. So let me now move to the larger scale and then hand off This graph shows representative power system evolution in 3 developing countries. And you'll notice something in common between them, and that is the color purple. Purple on this graph refers to coal-fired generation. And these are very representative of virtually all developing countries. South Africa at the bottom here is extraordinarily coal-heavy. India is rapidly building coal infrastructure. China has a whole lot more. These graphs are not on the same scale. When you have a system like that, with big factories burning coal 24 hours a day, never cooling down, the power system that you end up with is very inflexible. And that is a problem for all developing countries, because it means that if they want to introduce renewable sources, like wind energy or solar energy, that vary throughout the day, you have very little opportunity to adjust the existing power sources to accommodate it. And so this is a general problem that, fortunately, most African countries outside South Africa don't have. And that's because they have a lot of hydro. They're more like the power system in this country, which has a lot of different sources, and this is something that's enforced through policy in order to preserve flexibility in the system. So in the United States, we have coal, which is giving way to gas currently. In the United Kingdom, again, gas moving in to displace coal, but all kinds of other sources as well. Canada, a lot of hydro, but also highly varied system. Kenya, and this is taken from Amy's master's thesis, is a study, or a country that we study, and it's one that has a great deal of hydro. You can see how the system has evolved over time and how power has been produced. And you can also see from this big dip in hydro output, sometimes they have drought problems. Steady growth and sort of leveling off in the hydro. Now this is indicative of their having built out a lot of their available reservoir hydro capacity. They've dammed their rivers. Most of this capacity is on the town. So they have reservoirs, and they can hold water back if they want, not for very long, the reservoirs overflow and release it. But that gives them the flexibility to be able to incorporate renewable energy sources. And in particular, solar is one we look at. So Amy developed computer models that look at all of these hydros, looked at their available output, and looked at solar energy throughout the year, and determined that, as this graph shows, if you look over a 24-hour period, the additional generation that comes from solar at different levels of solar penetration in the country onto the grid, it's all being metered onto the grid, displaces a lot of diesel generation. A great deal of the electricity supply in Kenya and in many other sub-Saharan countries, because it's convenient to be built in relatively small doses, is delivered from diesel fuel. And so she's adding solar, and during the middle of the day, displacing diesel from the system. She's able to wind that down. And when she runs out of diesel to displace, she begins holding back water in the hydro reservoirs, which is what this blue area means. So she's making use of those reservoir systems. I'm out of time, or I have 3 minutes?
That's
3 over?
no, you can have 3.
I'm feeling good about it.
Generous.
We're on the home stretch. So what we're trying to show is that renewables, in particular solar, and there's a huge amount of solar potential, actually can be accommodated onto these relatively small systems, as I'll indicate, relatively painlessly, both in technical terms, that is the ability of the system to absorb this amount of power in this characteristic pattern, and also in terms of cost. So Amy also calculated the value of the solar energy at the time of day in which it's produced. In other words, what the wholesale buyer of power in Africa would be willing to pay, because he's displacing all of that diesel. And she found these lines, and what these lines indicate are that value for different kinds of rain years. This is a very dry year on top, in light blue, and then a medium year, and then a heavy rain year. It's less and less valuable. more hydro. And then she shows here 3 lines indicating feed-in tariffs in a couple of countries, South Africa, India, and Kenya. And the value is above those lines. In other words, it is worthwhile, it's advantageous to the operator of the system to pay these dashed line amounts to the solar provider, because it means he doesn't have to pay these much larger amounts to the diesel company. And it's shown as a function of the amount of solar PV that's added to the grid in megawatts. So she gets all the way up to about 1 gigawatt, which is almost half the size of the entire Kenyan power system. So that's a lot of PV. The story is similar in other parts of the country. So that's the end. We won't even run through these bullets, except for the last one. We're in a period of experimentation and rapid change in African power systems, and it's enabled through new technology. And that's what's giving us this proliferation of new solar products that are enabling people to have small amounts of electricity for the first time, and microgrids that may allow communities to be able to do things much more like what we do. But that creation of microgrids is also creating a new field, investigating how the differentiated use or a differentiated level of service that's provided to people can be traded off with cost in order to match their lifestyles and their capacity. So an interesting regulatory. And we're in a period in which international trade is becoming more and more important, which Amy will go. So we're now over to Ken. Thank you, and we'll have a panel again.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Rob. Really very important stuff. Our next speaker is Professor Kenneth Strzepek. Okay? Yeah. All right. Professor Strzepek is a research scientist at MIT's Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change. He's a non-resident senior research fellow at the UNU World Institute for Development Economics Research, adjunct professor of public policy at the Kennedy School, and professor emeritus of civil, environmental, and architectural engineering at the University of Colorado. Professor Strzepek has a PhD from MIT in water resources systems analysis and a number of other degrees. He told me the backstory to why he's here. It's kind of nice. But, you know, the bottom line is it's really great to have you here, and thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you. So do we have any undergraduates in the room? Only 2. 3? Okay, great. So I was an undergraduate here also, and we're going to see a little bit about that. And so we did have today, and for those, we're celebrating my 41st year of working in Africa. Okay, and this is how we did MIT Africa in the 70s. You found a professor who was doing something, you went over and did it. And I started working there, and here, September 1974, water were everywhere except, so this was my hometown. They heard I'd gone to Africa. So they were all excited. And here I was working with Professor Guggenheim in the anthropology department, and we were going there to do small-scale water storage systems, and I haven't been the same since. So I actually know a lot about public health because I got hepatitis when I'm there. So I'm now African, I'm told, because I have a piece of Africa in me. And we worked all over. And then this was me in 1974, and then I recreated that. I still have mine. And so I've been in Africa from the village level. I've also been on the faculty at University of Pretoria. I'm wearing my shirt today. So Africa's in my heart. So for the MIT Africa, I'm really happy to be part of that. But the future of Africa, as we'll see here, is related to energy. And this is one of the few slides. If you try to do this slide, along the bottom is some resource use, and here is wealth, as we'll use, BPP of gross domestic product. In development, we'll use that as a proxy. It isn't perfect. But if you try to do this with water, there's no line there. You find a big cloud. Trying to do it with other things. But what you find with development is electricity use. And with an R squared of 0.95. And look at Africa. It's down at the bottom, as Rob showed in a number of these other issues. So the issue is, how do we grow? How do we grow for wealth? How do we use that electricity? It's really important in development. We have to start doing it. What's the way that we do it? So we've ended up seeing recently, what's just come out is the Sustainable Development Goals. If you look at these, energy is in there, water is in there, the infrastructure is in there. The big problem is they all are conflicting. And what we're going to talk about a little bit here as we move forward, is a clash of values going on, as we're going to see in just a minute. So, energy policy. So, we're about to go to Paris in the next couple weeks. Some of you may actually even go. And the issue here, and this is work from Jake Jacoby from the joint program, is this idea of peak emissions, and we're going to have to start bringing them down. But to meet the goals of 2 degrees, we really have to be bringing it on this dashed line. Where are these going to come from? And so the view is that Copenhagen was this line, and this is what we're on. We're hoping to get down here and be Paris, but to meet that, we're going to need a second cycle. So we're going to have to get that down. And here's the problem: by 2040, this is the first Paris outcome. And we look, these are all, China's kind of leveling off. There's not going to be much down there. Other G20, the developed are on their way. The big issue here in this part is Africa. By 2050, we're talking well over on its way to 2 billion. And so how are we going to reduce this in Africa? Is hydro the answer for that? That's what we want to take a look at today. Yes or no? Well, let's see if we have an answer by the end. But there's a big push there. So Rob has mentioned this, that you can see where the access is less than 50% and where it's more than 50% for electrification. And we've seen that's important. Here's the consumption. A little note here, we're using almost 5,000 kilowatt hours here in South Africa. And then we look in Nigeria about 137, and over the different scales. So the Botswana here, we see the high use of fossil fuels down here in Southern Africa going with the economy. And if you look at that on the average consumption per person on the globe, South Africa is higher than the average consumption. Large smelters, all of the different industry, and look at that for the scale of the rest of the continent. Well, what's happening? So Rob talked about microgrids. We're getting the large scale energy. What are we going to do? Well, we found that there's quite a bit of fossil resources. Recently, there's the largest coal mine in the world in Mozambique. They found gas off of Tanzania and off of Mozambique. There's oil on the western coast. Oil here. They've just reinitiated this gas that they found off here. So look at all these resources. Are we going to let them stay in the ground as a resource so we can be carbon free? We saw what Rob talked about, the wind. The wind is sporadic here in the Sahara and some parts of South and East Africa. Hydro is dominated here in the central part and a little bit of Ethiopia. And then solar is potential everywhere. So how are we going to meet these needs? What is the role of hydro? So one of the things that Rob talked about and Amy's going to talk about later is maybe we have to have connections, but hydro generation for 2040 is adding 54,000 megawatts. That's an average size of a nuclear power plant is about 1,000 megawatts. That's adding 54 of those. And how is that going to be? Now, the interesting thing is that the AU, the African Union, is committed to what they call a clean energy corridor. And they're committed to low carbon growth. So what does that mean for Africa? And in this renewable, hydro is a really important part because it is centralized. They can put it in place and they know how to do it. Now, as we look to these curves, and so it's a perfect handoff. Where's Rob? As he showed these curves, these are the colors, and the colors are a little bit different. Water's blue, so it's usually always blue in these curves. And coal in this one is brown. But if we look in West Africa, there's a lot of gas which is looking as they move to the future, is projected to be a lot of gas with an increase of hydro. In Central Africa, primarily hydro, and this is the world-famous Grand Inga, 40,000 potential hydropower plant on the Congo River near Kinshasa. As we look at East Africa, it's significantly hydro right here, as Ethiopia develops its what they call water tower, but there's a lot of issues related here. And then we look in the southern part, and we see coal being important, and hydro and other renewables coming in here. So how is that going to happen? How does hydro fit within that? Well, here's one of the problems. One of the hurdles to hydro is its expense. If we're looking here at the cost per kilowatt for large-scale hydro, we're looking at nuclear. We take a look, that's the highest at 5,000. But then we start looking at hydro, and with a dam, running the river with a dam, we're talking $3,000, $4,000 dollars per kilowatt hour. And when you look at some of the other alternatives, particularly the coal, they're much less. So if you have coal in the ground and you can build a power plant for 1/3 the cost of building a hydropower plant, what are you going to do? So one of the important things, how many have taken engineering economics? And you know about discounting, right? So even if you get free fuel, which is what hydro is, how much of an increase in the upfront capex costs can you absorb and still make economic sense? And that's one of the key issues is what do you use for a social rate of discount, or what do you use for the cost of capital to look at that. So hydro is expensive. The other thing that hydro has, what economists call externalities. Anybody tell me one externality of building a dam? What happens to the people that live behind it? They're not usually very happy. Okay, we also can flood out as we did the Hyatt Dam. 90 ancient temples are flooded there now. They moved some of the bigger ones. They have social, environmental, and other cultural impacts that happen. So we may not give off carbon, but we give off other things. There's a group, International Rivers in the United States, who fight vigorously against any hydro plant anywhere in the world. So it's not a panacea as we look here. The other thing, and Rob pointed it out very nicely, is this is rainfall in West Africa. And we're seeing here in the Sahel, there is a downward trend over that period. But what's important is if we look at the moving average, we have decadal fluctuation. So this is going to be the Niger River flow, which will impact the hydro that's available. So the thing about hydro is it's a function of climate. So climate is variable. And in Africa, it's probably the most variable in the world. So what we worry about with hydro, with electric system, is the firm energy, not the average energy. So we have to know when we want to release that water, it's there. And the other thing is that hydropower is the flow through the turbine, but also the head behind it. So if the dam is empty and you get the water flow, you get significantly less hydro than if the dam is full. So these things are quite variable in the hydro production. So what we're going to do is take a look now in an engineering economic sense of what's going on. So this is a model developed at the institute where I work sometime in Helsinki, the UNU, World Economics Development Institute. And this is the future of South Africa if there is no carbon tax to economically develop energy to meet the goals that the country has of electrification. And even though Africa uses so much, it's used by so few, primarily in industry. So how do we bring that energy there? And so if we grow this way, it's going to be coal. If you use economics as the only metric for optimizing over the next 40 years. If you have a policy where you're going to use domestic renewables, wind and solar, but you allow nuclear to come in, then we see a huge increase in nuclear in about 15 years from now. So that's starting it now, they will come online here. Huge debate in South Africa. Do we bring nuclear in? They have 2 nuclear plants now. Do they want to extend those? So there's another values issue. The other thing is, as Rob pointed out, if they say we will allow imports of renewable, and primarily from Inga in the DRC, carrying electricity all the way from Kinshasa down to Cape Town, we would bring in this as renewable up here. This is all hydro. This is imported hydro. This is the domestic hydro. We bring that in also from some from the Zambezi. But can you imagine, from a national security point of view, having more than 50% of your energy coming from 2,000 miles away through Angola? So these are the issues we have to deal with putting hydro, as Rob said. It's not where it's being generated where they don't need it or can't even use it yet in DRC to places where they want to use it. So there are costs of using hydro here. There is a demand they would take it tomorrow, but all of these issues that are going on here. The next thing that happens is when we dam a river, okay, this is the Zambezi River, we do some things. So right now the Batoka Dam, which is right below Victoria Falls, is being planned by the Zimbabweans. It will wipe out 20 kilometers of some of the best whitewater rafting in the world. Okay, so there's a big push against that. But who goes whitewater rafting? White people generally, not locals. If you look at the value of ecotourism, right, so they want energy, right? So it's really issue. I just did the Nile River. We went down the White Nile, and I went back and said, it's tourism, it's ecotourism. So how much do we trade off ecotourism, and it's not that many jobs, versus damming the river so that there can be electricity for Zambia and Zimbabwe. Again, a values issue. So I'm going to all the rapids right now before they fall in. But the other thing that happens is once we dam the water, most of our projects are multi-purpose. So this is an example from the Zambezi multi-sector investment opportunities, is that if we operate the Zambezi for maximum hydropower, we can get about this much. If we operate it for maximum irrigation for food security, it's down here. So what we learn in our systems classes is we want to find out what's called the Pareto front. So we're going to go up here, and this is the trade-off. But we're still losing about 30%, 28% of our hydro to have this much irrigation. So we're now having about clean energy versus food security and hunger and nutrition. So that's the other issue that happens here. Or we can burn coal and put carbon into the air. And so,
I have a couple of figures up.
okay, good. We're almost done. So here comes the issue is the environmental dilemma. There's no road to development that does not greatly improve access to energy services. Expanded access to energy services for pro-poor development implies an increase in CO2 emissions that are incompatible with the precautionary climate principle. So this is the issue. There's simply not enough space remaining for today's poor to develop along the same paths as those who are by taking already wealthy and members of what we are calling the global consumer country. That's one of the issues. Paris is saying we have to stop it. We've already got ours. What about the next generation? So last thing is public policy. So in the United States, there's a law now that says right here that the Secretary of Treasury shall tell anyone working in development banks to oppose any loan, grant, or strategy or policy that would lead to the construction of large hydro dams. So the World Bank has not funded a large hydro dam in a long time because the U.S. representative on the board will have to veto it. So what happens? Along comes China. These are the current projects that are being done. And one of the issues is not that the U.S. is wonderful and have not done the same kind of thing, but these projects have no safeguards. People don't like the World Bank. When I work for them, they have an environmental safeguard and a social safeguard, and you may not think it's enough, but they are safeguarding it. There are 3 or 4 dams I worked on that the bank would not fund that are being funded by the Chinese now. And these are Chinese all over Africa. So that's what's happening there. So the other threat to this is climate change. This is work we just completed for the bank looking at, this is Victoria Falls. And this is the risk to the Batoka project and the South Africa power pool that Amy will talk a little bit of climate change. So there's great uncertainty in climate change, but in this case, close to 70% of the future looks at a loss of hydropower due to carbon emissions and the changing climate in southern Africa. So these are just some of the things that we do. So yes, hydropower is important, but 6 of the top 10 discoveries of oil have been found in Africa. Are they going to leave them in the ground? Or are they going to develop those to help the economy grow? And what do we do for hydropower in light of the development costs and climate policy? Those things are really important. So E for D, yes, energy for development, but at what cost and how? And that's why we have a really difficult issue that's related to values and culture as well as technology and climate. So it's a wonderful good group that here. We'll look forward to our questions later.
Fantastic, thanks very much, Ken. You're on this one.
We got it here. We got it here, so she has the club.
Oh, she's on yours
Yeah,
as
she
well?
went everywhere.
She's on everywhere. This is great, fantastic.
New York Times tomorrow.
All right, so this is really a fascinating discussion. I was in Kampala over the summer, a great Ugandan city, and the thing that struck me at night was how dark it was compared to Boston or cities in the United States. And you know, what I didn't think about, oh boy, there should be more light in Kampala, I thought, wow, we really waste electricity in the United States. It was just stunning to me. I think really striking. So, now that you are set up, let's give you an introduction. Amy Michelle Rose is a graduate student in MIT's Institute for Data Systems and Society. You got the new title, formerly EST. Her work focuses on issues surrounding regional electricity markets in developing countries. She's also worked on renewable energy integration in developing countries, focusing on large-scale solar power in Kenya, and Rob and Ken both pointed out her work. She holds a master's degree in technology and policy from MIT and bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering and space physics from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Wow. And you know, this is interesting. Amy served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Burkina Faso. So it's great to have you tell us about your work, Amy. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me without the mic, or should I? Okay. Thanks for coming. So Rob kind of did a great job of framing the issues and some of the big challenges. Ken touched on technology choices. And my comments are really going to focus on a strategy that a lot of governments and international organizations are now talking about, which is regional power pools or regional electricity systems. And a power pool is basically a group of utilities that agree to coordinate their operations and planning to some degree. They exist all over the world. Here in the US, we call them regional transmission organizations. In Europe, they have the internal energy market. Power pools are in Central America, South America, Asia, and now a lot of regions in Sub-Saharan Africa are getting very excited about power pools. And there are a lot of reasons why all over the world people are pursuing this strategy. The first is really a desire to decrease cost. So by pooling demand from multiple countries, you can better utilize your most efficient or cheaper generators. Also, especially for small countries, by pooling demand, you can capture economies of scale and build larger plants that have lower per unit costs. Additionally, there's an idea that by increasing competition, if you have more people bidding into the market as buyers and sellers, you can decrease costs just through greater competition. The other big motivation is to increase security of supply. So this is both strategic security of supply. You can pool resources from multiple countries, diversify your generation mix, and have a hedge against droughts or fuel price spikes. Then there's also operational security of supply. If a plant goes down or a line goes down in your country or your region, you have a network of other people who can support you. And typically for international power pools, this is part of a much broader kind of regional integration strategy. In Africa, for the last few years, people have been very excited about power pools. The UN Commission for Africa said that they're the best strategy to deal with Africa's energy problems. Just a few months ago, the World Energy Council said we strongly believe that the optimal solution for the energy crisis in Africa is to go regional. So why are all these organizations excited about power pools? The first, as Ken touched on, we should have coordinated our slides again, is that resources are abundant in Africa, but they're not uniformly distributed in form or location. So on the right, in red, these are the coal resources, mostly in South Africa. In blue, natural gas, and then this kind of ugly green color, these are oil resources. And then on the right, these are hydro resources, so mostly in Ethiopia and the DRC. So by pooling supplies across multiple countries, some of these countries that have more resources than they would ever develop for their own generation, they can share them with their neighbors who may not have as many domestic resources. The other big motivation is to capture economies of scale. And this is particularly important for Sub-Saharan African countries or Central American countries that have very small systems. So this plot shows the installed capacity in megawatts for all of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, except South Africa, because it's so much bigger than everyone else. It skews the scale. And a notable thing is the number of countries that have installed capacity of less than 1 gigawatt, or even less than 500 megawatts. And when you think about what's the typical size for a utility scale gas, coal, nuclear plant, those plants which are bigger are cheaper to make, cheaper to operate. That starts at about 300 megawatts, and then economies of scale exist up to a gigawatt. So this, you can't really see it. This yellow bar, which starts about there, is kind of the beginning range for economies of scale to think about building a utility scale plant of that size. And there are a number of countries that don't have systems that are large enough even to justify building that kind of plant. So a big motivation for pooling demand across multiple countries is that suddenly it might make economic sense to build a cheaper gas plant or a cheaper coal plant instead of these small, expensive diesel gen sets, which are currently going up all over Sub-Saharan Africa. So what's happening? Right now, there are 5 power pools, all in kind of various stages of existence on the continent. I'll be focusing on these 4 in Sub-Saharan Africa. So in order of least developed to most developed in peak, this is the Central African Power Pool. I would say this is still just kind of an idea in the minds of folks at the World Bank at this stage. In blue, this is the East African Power Pool. They've done some long-term studies, they've worked on some market rules, but only a handful of these countries actually have interconnections, and there's not much trading happening. So it's still in the early stages. In red, this is the West African Power Pool. They've made a lot of progress building regional plants, building regional transmission lines, and they're in the process right now of designing their market. And then in orange, this is the Southern African Power Pool, by far the most developed. It's been operating for 20 years. This was obviously drawn by the SAP because they've included the DRC and Tanzania as part of their power pool. But these countries are already playing quite some of their power pools, but they're a little biased. So most of my comments will be focused on the experience in the SAP because that's the only one that actually exists and it's been going for 20 years. Now there are a lot of benefits, like I said, to power pooling, but actually developing a power pool, particularly a regional power pool, is very hard. It takes years, not just in the Sub-Saharan African context. In Europe, it's taken 20 years. In Central America, it's taken about 18 years. And it's a challenge because regions have to have a couple of things. The first is you need to have transmission infrastructure between countries so they can actually trade. In all of the Sub-Saharan African power pools, this is a big barrier. There's not enough transmission infrastructure between countries, but also within one country so that they can actually have power flow through their country to neighbors. The other big challenge, and also in thinking about grid infrastructure, we have to remember kind of that plot of the map of Africa that says how big is Africa, and it shows Europe and the US and China and all these other countries within Africa. I'm sure you've seen it. So thinking about the size of how long these transmission lines actually have to go, we're talking 10, 20, 50 times the geographic size of the European market. So these are huge transmission investments. The other thing you need to have is adequate generation capacity. If you don't have enough supply to meet demand at home, it's very unlikely people will be happy with you exporting power. And this is what's happened in the Southern African Power Pool. In 2008, when South Africa ran out of excess power, Eskom, their national utility, was forced to go back and renegotiate all of their contracts so that they couldn't export because that was just politically infeasible in their publicly owned company. Also important, you need to have legal rules for cross-border trading. These rules need to be transparent, they need to be equitable across all the members, and they need to be predictable so that people can make long-term decisions about investments. And in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, a key thing to think about in trading rules is who gets to participate and how do they get to participate. And I say this because a lot of the utilities are still in the structure of publicly owned, vertically integrated utilities. So that means from each country, you have one person participating on behalf of that country and bidding into the regional market. And it doesn't make it a very conducive environment for increased competition and reduced prices. And it sets up a lot of potential problems with market power and abusing market power. In the SAP, almost all of the countries have either changed rules or are in the process of changing rules to allow independent power producers or private generation companies to build plants in their countries. So that's a huge step forward. The problem is the second half of that question of how do people get to participate? In this SAP, IPPs can only bid into the regional market if they have permission from their national governments. And of the 12 members, only 2 have granted that permission. So these private companies that want to build a plant have to sell to the state-owned utility company. They don't have the option to participate in the regional market, which makes it a little harder to incentivize them to come and build. And then finally, developing regional institutions and regional regulations is critical. You need to be able to harmonize the operations, so a lot of technical rules about stability need to be harmonized so that the systems can actually coordinate their operations. But you also need to have harmonized rules about how you bid, the timing of your bids, and then you need to have a regional regulator, regional system operator, regional market operator, all of these entities that are not from a single country, but they can be kind of an objective regional authority. And the regional regulator particularly is critical because they need to have the authority to make rules and then enforce those rules. So in the first 10 years of the SAP, there was no regional regulator. Only 4 countries even had a national regulator. So the countries were kind of used to this mode of operation where the utilities just police themselves. So if you're a private company and you're interested in building a plant there, it's kind of a scary place to build because what happens if somebody acts non-competitively? Who can you go to? The utilities have kind of formed this club. So now things have changed a little bit. Now 12 countries have national regulators. They have a regional regulatory association, but it's not an authority. They can't make rules. They can't enforce rules. So it's still a big barrier for them. And probably overall, the biggest challenge for regional power pools is just a change in mindset, from a national mindset to a regional mindset. So this means that national regulators, national planners, national system operators would have to cede some authority to their regional counterparts. And it's a challenge. It's been a challenge everywhere. In Europe, in Central America, in South America, it's always a challenge. But also changing your mindset in terms of security of supply and trusting countries. When there's a shortage, can you be counted on to still deliver the power that you promised to export to the neighboring country? And this is a problem they're currently facing in Central America, where in times of shortages, people weren't honoring their contracts. So now they're trying to figure out, well, how can you write the contract so that this isn't a problem? But with all that being said, there are a lot of reasons why power pools make sense for Sub-Saharan Africa and why they should continue trying to pursue them. So I'll just conclude with kind of some key opportunities. The first is just huge cost savings. Rob touched on the magnitude of investment that's needed in the next 20 years. And there have been lots of computer models and academic studies that show regional coordination can save you lots of money because you're sharing generation, you're trading between countries that have cheap supplies with countries that have no local resources. And so you're able to save both in operation costs, but also in investment costs. The other thing is if you have a regional market where people may find it easier to build a plant and have a lot more options of where to sell their power, there's an opportunity to attract private sector investment for generation, but also for transmission, if there are rules in place for how people can recover the cost of their transmission line. The other thing is there's an opportunity to develop some regional expertise in how you operate and regulate a regional market. The market rules that are appropriate for Sub-Saharan African power pools are not going to be the same ones that worked for the US. They're not going to be the same ones that worked in Central America or Europe because the context is different. So these countries have a real opportunity to kind of develop their own expertise and their own way of doing things that's suitable for this context. And then finally, and this goes back to some of the things Kim was touching on, these systems can create a more robust integrated system to hedge themselves against price spikes or against uncertainty due to climate change for a lot of these countries that are based heavily on hydropower. So I think I'll stop there, so we have some time for questions. Right.
Thanks so much. Amy Rose, that was great. You know, we are over time, but that is okay with me, and we can occupy this room for a bit longer. So if I could invite the three speakers up to the front to form a panel, and let us go for a 10-minute discussion and see how we're doing at that point. Okay.
So my question was, there are two broad things that you guys have talked about. One was at a high level, top-down, here's what we need, and here's policies and here's the rules that we might require. And the other was on the ground, household and solar home systems. Assuming that the government doesn't do much or much, it might take a longer time, what's the type of policy and technology required for the water pumping strategy to be really integrated? The batteries, innovation, transmission, such that you actually have a system evolving which can consume more power.
Sorry, Shep.
So the question is, how do you encourage that sort of bottom-up construction of the system? And
What does that look like?
what does it look like? Well, we're trying to find out. Our assumptions all come back to, at least initially, a presumption that the optimal system is the least cost system in terms of capital deployed. So to make it work at the very lowest level, you have the right sorts of low-cost technologies, and usually you have to have some sort of amount of government subsidy. And that subsidy and the importance of the subsidy grows as you get to larger and larger deployments or plants. To make that happen, to really get large, I think probably involves much of the stuff that both Ken and to a larger extent Amy talked about. Harmonization of regulation within the regions to enable these power pools to evolve so that larger plants can be built. That's my answer.
Only one of the things they're working also now is micro hydro and mini hydro and those things. And there's a lot of people coming into Africa, and the biggest problem now is they're being done by non-hydrologic engineers who don't understand what's going on, and investors are getting cold feet because they haven't taken the course over at the Parsons Lab on variability of flow. And so that's one of the problems. Coming in with incorrect technology is scaring the market away. And so and that's really in Uganda, they're pushing public-private partnerships on that and trying to work on the regulations and institutions, I think, are the key issues, like you said, and bringing them in there.
I think we won't be able to have everyone answer every question. I just didn't have enough time. So next question.
That was a great presentation. Each one of you feel overwhelmed with all this knowledge that's so necessary. Things I would ask is, a question that I'm sure all of you ask yourself in turn is, what about the politics of this? Yes, these are, the solutions make a lot of sense, but for example, I'm first generation Nigerian American, I've lived there for a while. We're surrounded by Niger, Cameroon, and Benin Republic, and we don't get along. You can see it when we play soccer. Okay, so why are we going to use how are you going to convince us, we compete with Ghana all the time, how are you going to convince us that here, we're going to bring the money, in Nigeria we have a little bit more money than Benin or whatever, and we're going to use that, instead of taking it all the way into the internal villages, we're going to send it to Cameroon and the Niger Republic. I'm sure you've thought about this. Give it a shot.
Sure, well, I guess I'll talk about it mostly in the context of power pooling. So Ignacio Perez Arriaga, who just arrived, has a great story about the Central American power pool and countries that continued to trade while they were at war. Because the rules were in place, the economic incentives were there, and so the market kept functioning. In terms of investments, it's a huge issue. A lot of these investments, like I talked about, only make sense at a regional scale. Some of these power plants, it wouldn't make sense to build them unless you're intending to share it among multiple countries. And over the summer, we were in Southern Africa talking with utility companies and regulators and system operators, and they all said a huge issue for us is getting cross-border transmission lines, because South Africa and Zimbabwe want to build a line, but it makes the most sense if it happens to pass through Botswana, but Botswana doesn't care about it, so they're refusing to pay. And it really boils down to, you have to have a method of allocating costs among the beneficiaries. So you have to have a method of calculating what are the benefits, who is benefiting from this project, and then allocating costs accordingly to beneficiaries. And then you need a regional regulator that has the authority to do this calculation and then to assign costs among the parties. And right now, that's a key thing that's missing, is they don't have this kind of central, independent, regional body that can coordinate these things.
Do you have that question?
I just wanted to say that you've made me about as depressed about the prospects for African development as I've been in a while, because I'm convinced by what you say. But if I put it all together, Rob, you began by saying, and I think you're right, that you need a lot of energy in order to have development. These things are correlated. It's not exactly clear what the causation is, but you need that energy for development. You point out how difficult it is, given the nature of the geographic patterns of settlement, to make good investments that make sense. And then we heard that we've got now international pressures which are weighing against the lowest cost solutions for investment in energy in Africa. Just to make it harder. And I'm sorry, but Amy's presentation, when I look at, as a political scientist who's thought about Africa for a while, and I think about all those requirements for regional development of power along the lines of this last question. I mean, we can't get the investment, in a single country. You look at South Africa, has really underinvested in its own country, let alone these regional solutions. I mean, come on, regional regulator, forget about it. Most of Africa trying to have really good, stable trade regimes and to have people think about investments that are going to carry us out 20 years. I'm sorry, this leaves me really depressed. And I think it's important. I think the technological, at the end, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think the conclusion is, boy, we really, really need lower cost energy solutions that can be installed on a kind of decentralized, localized level, because the logistical, investment, and political barriers that you guys are talking about are huge.
So here's the good news, Emma. We're all going to die if we go down this path of not somehow finding a way to implement these things. Because I think Africa is widely understood to be the big mid-century problem in climate change. So the world is strongly incentivized to step in with external resources, money, to enable us to have that. And I think that, there is strong recognition amongst the leadership of some countries, at least the ones that I've talked with, that they can't go down this fossil path, and they need to find different ways. I don't know what to make of South Africa's carbon tax. There was also an announcement today where the Chinese hold a lot of nuclear power. At least that's an attempt to move away from coal. It's not that optimistic.
Well, thanks for that presentation. I have a question regarding the bottom-up approach a little bit, but on the investment side. So when I saw, Rob, your first points, those look pretty formidable, these barriers to investment, right, in terms of all the things that are needed. But then when I thought about it, it's very much barriers for foreign capital. There is small, there's lots of investment, hotels, construction, businesses, locally at the scale that's about the same size as a mini grid. So my question is really about, is a lot of, because financing renewable energy deployment is a big topic in the international arena, is a lot of it targeted towards foreign capital investment, too much so, potentially? And if that's the case, how do you get more local experimentation and investment in renewable energy? And just as an example, you know, I was telling you before, just came back, we had a project in Somaliland where we installed a solar system at a hotel. We tried to have a contract, the hotel owner said, won't, you know, only a handshake, didn't want a contract. So this is an environment where those barriers, he's very successful there and does a lot of good business, and those barriers aren't relevant for him. So how do we actually get that large market of that right size of capital? This one I did was $30,000, not a big system, you know, in that range, to build up investment and energy at that level.
Are you going to answer or no?
So, is there a bias first towards foreign capital, towards local for this in the international discussion?
Not in my experience, but my experience in that regard is what I've lived in. I think personally that it comes down to whether it's foreign capital or domestic capital, finding projects or enabling projects to be financed. And, you know, we have a couple of things going on right now. Amy talked about power pools, and I think that power pools and this process of harmonizing regional practices and getting real rules in place is a critical part of that. If you don't have a ready market for the power that you generate somewhere out there, if it's not local, it's got to be somewhere, you're not going to build it. So I think that that's terribly important for enabling capital to be there. Just as another thing that's going on, perhaps reinforces that message, Power Africa is the U.S. government's recently announced attempt to advance project finance. Project finance that favors the purchase of American equipment, or whatever. And they're not doing that well. You know, their approach is to go project by project and say, what's the barrier here? What do we got to do to overcome it? And you know, it's like peeling onion. It's one problem after another problem after another problem, and it comes down to not really having the market practices in place and market mechanisms that enable trade. That's my.
So along the same lines, for someone who's interested in kind of developing solar systems, you know, in Africa, what are some of the challenges that we should foresee individuals who have, for example, that have used diesel generators and have used it, other lives and aren't willing to kind of move off of that to use solar, for example. So what are the challenges that we should recognize in terms of really changing behaviors and having them adopt solar? Is it just economics or is it something more than that?
Yeah. So my personal experience, when I was living in Burkina Faso, I was in a rural village with no electricity. And I'd always heard that people didn't want to use solar because they thought it was an inferior form of electricity. And I didn't experience that at all. People didn't want to invest in solar in my village because the grid was going to come. It was always promised to come next year. And so that's why they didn't want to invest. So I think, and this is not an easy answer for you, I'm sorry, but I mean, you need kind of more long-term signals from governments about what's being planned, what are the future grid extensions, and if there's uncertainty, especially people who are interested in doing something bigger, like kind of supplying at the village level, like solar home systems, or maybe even a microgrid, then there needs to be some thinking about, well, what happens when the grid comes? Are you just out of luck? Is there a way for them to buy those assets from you and you can recover your cost? But that's a big problem, right? Because it's kind of you have to think about national level regulations and policies.
Just to add, in Ethiopia, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is under construction, which was forced by the government on all government employees had to buy bonds. So it's almost exclusively domestic funded. And that was driven by politics, and it's causing a big issue in the Nile, which we're working on. But right now, there are factories that aren't working yet in Addis, in the industrial zone, because there's no electricity. But there's, the line from the GERD is not there yet. So the Chinese want to bring investments to there. So when it hurts, or when they start seeing the impacts, then there's going to be the movement, I think, to the investments, because that's starting to happen when they see the need.
Okay, so we're going to take a question here, and then maybe one more, and two more. And then I think we need to wrap up. Okay, so please.
So I have a quick question. I know that China was mentioned a couple times throughout the commission presentations, and I do think that the relationship between Africa and China has a lot of impact on energy and infrastructure and development, because China has often filled in, as was mentioned a few times, because Western countries were not there for political or financial reasons. So I was wondering if any or all of you could comment on maybe what that relationship is like. Is it, in terms of energy, a progressive one for green, like climate change and sustainable development, or what is your sort of impression of that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, my impression is that they're recognizing that there's a considerable desire to have electrical power in Africa amongst the Africans, and they're responding to that. But I think Ken also made some excellent points about how in some cases they're hurrying projects in ways that make those countries ultimately unhappy. My general experience over the last decade or so, as China has become more active in Africa, is that there were a lot of initial hopes and gratitude and goodwill, and that's been damaged by a lot of that sort of behavior.
Yeah, I mean, they see it as a good market for solar on that, but on the large infrastructure, Sino Hydro, which is doing all these projects, it's rapid and move out. And we saw the same thing with the Soviet bloc in the Hayas 1 dam. The turbines wore out in 7 years, and we put U.S. turbines in. So that whole issue of the quality that's going in is in question. So that's also, they're doing a lot of other infrastructure. Right now, the African Development estimates 40% of all infrastructure development is Chinese funded currently in Africa, which is an amazing amount.
Usually also Chinese built.
Yes, it isn't local employment, it's Chinese, and there's all kinds of rumors that I'm not an expert on it, but some of it are prisoners doing the work. Many stay in open Chinese restaurants, is what they say. All kinds of things that are happening, which are short-term for both the governments. China has political reason for doing it, as the U.S. and Europe have. But the countries need infrastructure now, and their discount rate is so high that I want to have a road, and even if it falls down in 5 years, I get credit for putting a road in. And we see that all over, where maintenance isn't funded and projects are there just to get that time. So it is a real big issue.
Okay, terrific. And ultimate question, and ultimate.
So we've been talking a lot about the need for good, transparent policies and regulations to support private sector investment in these countries. And I was just curious what your experience has been in countries that have set up rural energy agencies, and kind of what power they are actually given to help participate in the planning of off-grid infrastructure, and then how that aligns with on-grid infrastructure. Because I know one of the big barriers is there's not the transparency around how the grid's getting planned. And when they've set up these agencies, but what can they actually do if they don't know what infrastructure is actually coming, and then how do they work with people like coming from IT who have great ideas or want to help them build off-grid infrastructure? How do you see that kind of system playing out on the ground?
I don't think there is an REA. The REAs I've had contact with are in Tanzania, Kenya, and Nigeria. And I think, with the possible exception of Kenya, they're pretty effective.
Yeah.
And for all of the reasons you say, they're still part of the system.
Yeah.
And if the system isn't being planned, with the incentives for people to invest in all aspects of the system, not much gets done. There's also a lack of expertise.
Right.
One of the things that our group is doing, I should say, Professor Ignacio Perez-Arriaga has entered the room. He's an authority on all these things, and absolutely our intellectual leader. What we're trying to do is understand how some of these small-scale systems could be incorporated into the bigger systems, and what regulations pertain there. And that's not so hard. It's trying to harmonize regional trade. So we're hopeful that there's an opportunity for
Actual related to that, so what's like your perspectives on future scenario of energy in Africa between utility scale and like decentralized? I mean, like for me, it seems like if you have like utility scale electricity generation and you need like large investments, that's like why you need like Chinese investments. But like for decentralized, it's more like bottom up and localized investments. So I don't know, like what will be the future picture of that?
I don't think those are mutually exclusive. So many communities are so there's the distance to all these rural communities and populations is so great that I think for those areas to have access to electricity, off-grid solutions are the way to go. They won't see the grid for decades. At the same time, you can't grow an economy on a microgrid. And so at the same time, you have to have centralized, large-scale, utility-scale type investments. But I don't think that means you have to pick a path. I think you can develop both in parallel.
I mean, it's pretty unsatisfactory. Okay, first, we have to have world peace, then harmonize regional trade practices, and raise $10 trillion to build a transportation system. And you can have a light bulb in Karen, Rwanda. You can skip most of the steps and have a light bulb. But you can't have, as Amy says, industry powered by lanterns. So ultimately, these things, the grid looks like the right answer. That may not be true, but it certainly looks like the right answer. So perhaps things like microgrids will be subsumed into a larger system, and there need to be rules for that as well, which is something we also
To wrap it up, the issue is, it's an issue of scale and economic development policy. And at the recent wider 30th anniversary, there were a few Nobel Prize winners and the former World Bank chief economists. And everything's talking about structural change, that you can't reduce poverty through agricultural improvement, that we need to. So urbanization is happening. So there's two processes going at once. Urbanization, which is requiring centralized, gridded, and that's easier to get to, and the people are coming there. And then you need urbanization for industry because you need centralization. So that's happening. But the rural, in Africa, the rural are still going to be there. So it's a value judgment of how to get there, and I think it's exactly that. The rural will be left behind unless we come up with excellent off-grid solutions, because all the focus for the numbers of GDP and all the things that ministries of finance want are centralized and will be driven by the grid. And off-grid is a value judgment because it's so much higher in what we want to do. So we need to do both at the same time.
Okay, I would like to close this discussion firstly by thanking the speakers for really excellent